Pleasure to be here.
I just had a few questions about your work to kind of share with the people that will be interacting with the Worcester Area Writers Database.
Great.
My first question is, how did you get into the noir crime scene of creative writing?
I guess the short answer is accidentally. I think I've given different answers to that question when it's been asked over the years, and I think they're all true, on some level. I would say one answer is that I grew up in Worcester, and Worcester is to some degree, Worcester is a kind of a classic noir city. I have described in the past sort of crucial formative years during my teens when there was a what we now call grindhouse cinema downtown. We just called it an art cinema or a second showing cinema. It was called the Paris down on Franklin Street, and you could go down there on a Friday or Saturday night and see 2 movies for $1. But the movies were very often kind of classic 1970s kind of dark, downbeat crime narratives, and so my buddies and I would we'd sort of meet on the street corner and tramp the 4 miles downtown, and we'd watch films like The Nickel Ride and Dirty Harry and Prime Cut and sort of these classic tough guy. They're actually kind of neo-noir. They're an update on the original noir canon of the 40s and 50s. But what I've often said is when the movies would get out, I would then walk back home. And it occurred to me one night, I remember sort of looking at, as I was walking back home, looking at these closed down factories and these seedy nightclubs and these burned out neon signs. And this looks a lot like what I just saw on the screen, Right. So I sort of, that mindset was implanted a little bit at a young age. Beyond that, I would say that it's sort of a happy commercial accident in that the first couple novels that I wrote that have never been published were not noir novels. They were not crime novels. They had no mystery element to them at all. And then what happened is the third book that I wrote was based on an anecdote that my wife gave me one night when we were out driving, and I started to play with it a little bit, and it turned into it turned out to have some noir elements, to have some crime elements, some hard-boiled elements to it. And I had, at that time, I was rereading some of the early hard-boiled guys that I liked, Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler. And everything just sort of came together. My memories of the landscape of my teen years, rereading some of those great 1930s and 40s hard-boiled writers, and the particular story which I was working on. And then what happened, of course, is that was the book that sold. And so, as tends to be the case, my agent and my editor and the publisher all came back and said, write another one like that.
Right.
So that's what happened.
Okay. So it was kind of a mixture of things. It wasn't.
It was, yeah. There's no one definitive influence that sort of turned me down the noir alley. It was a lot of different things from my formative years, both in terms of my environment and my reading and my film going. And
okay,
yeah.
Your work is proof that I would say that the romantic and unsettling view of organized crime still exists. What is your inspiration for Buzzcoat, Frankie Loftus, all the Gray Roaches and the Herman Kinski?
Yeah.
How were you able to make them so real?
Well, thank you. That's a matter of opinion, I guess. That's just. I guess I want to say that. I think there is a reader who it does surprise them when sort of a middle class schmuck like myself can create sort of these very cold-blooded sociopathic characters. And my answer to that is always that's my job. You know, that's sort of that's what you do when you're a writer. I always remember how instructive it was when my first book came out, and I was doing a local signing, and a guy I hadn't seen for a long time, an old pal, sort of came through. He had read the book already, and he came through the line, and he said, "Hey, I gotta ask you, you know, growing up, I had no idea. When did you become such a gun fanatic? You know, there's all this stuff about guns, and you have the books." And I said, I don't know anything about guns. You know, I don't own a gun. I don't. And he said, "But there's all this stuff." And I said, "Yeah, I went to the Worcester Public Library for an hour and took notes. That's what we do. You know, that's what as I've said to writing students in the past, you know, your job is you don't need to know everything in the world. You just have to convince the reader that you do. You know, your job is to create that sense of verisimilitude. The other thing I would say about that is that I am I like research. I'm sort of I enjoy wandering in a library and letting one book lead me to another book to another book. So it's a function of the job, you know.
Okay. Because I mean, just looking at some of those gangs, I can just literally, I mean, it's one thing to read something, but having it actually make an image in your it just, I don't know.
Well, the other thing that I can speak to about that is that I can't speak for any other writers, I guess. The way that I operate is pretty instinctually. My gut determines a lot of choices that I make. So that what will often happen will be, if I'm constructing either I'm working on pulling together a character or a gang, as you say, you know, I will read, in Wireless, for instance, I'll give you an example. I remember reading several books about the Khmer Rouge and the atrocities in Cambodia in the 70s, and I remember, you know, you don't know what you're going to need, so you sort of wade into lots of research material, and then your gut recognizes it when you see something. I remember reading some book on Cambodia and coming to a detail where the Khmer Rouge used to, they were big on one way of eliminating their enemies was to douse them in benzene, and boom. And that's the kind of thing, you read that paragraph and you go, oh, well, there's going to be a scene in the book where that happens, you know, obviously. But I've read, you know, when I was doing research on my latest book, The Resurrectionist, I read books about motorcycle gangs and Hell's Angels. Now, the gang that I create, the Abominations, they're they're over the top. It's very much, the book is, to some degree, phantasmagorical. So I let myself take as many liberties as I want, as long as I have sort of what I'm striving for is this underpinning of specifically chosen details that sort of give you this foundation that once you have it in place, then you can do all kinds of crazy things.
So one of the things, I know many writers have different kind of ways of going about finding a story. How do you do it? Do you have a specific process? Does it just come on a lark? How does...
I have never, for whatever reason, you know, I've always had the opposite problem. You know, I'm bombarded by too many story ideas, you know, every day. I can't drive to the store to pick up a gallon of milk without getting 4 story ideas. You know, it's just sort of the way my brain is wired. 99% of those die on the vine. I am I'm sort of an obsessive cultivator of my own notebook. You know, I've kept notebooks since I was 7 or 8 years old. And today I think of it as just the notebook, capital T, capital N, as this one sort of chaotic and sprawling data bank.
Right.
And what I'll do is, you know, on any given day, if a particular story notion occurs to me, I almost always have a notebook with me. I'll carry a small notebook on my person. There'll be a notebook in my car. There'll be a notebook, you know, next to my reading chair at home. Sometimes there'll be I'll have a micro recorder with me sometimes if I'm driving and can't write. And I'll try to make some sort of an abbreviated note just to sort of pin down, so I don't, especially as my memory continues to erode, so that I can just pin it down. And as I say, so my notebooks are full. I've got 10,000 notebook pages filled with ideas that never came to fruition, never gestated at all. And then every now and then there'll be one idea that is just, it wants to be enfleshed in language. It pushes me and stays with me and is tenacious and sort of, won't leave me alone. And that's when I know, that one probably developed into a book. What I sometimes find, years ago I read an interview where Stephen King was asked either that question or a similar question about the origin of story ideas, and he said something that just struck so true to me. This is very often the case. This was the case, a story idea I had last week that just has really hit me hard. He said often it's when two disparate ideas suddenly come together in a way he didn't anticipate. They might be ideas for two different stories,
Right.
that would seem to have no connection whatsoever. They're not tied together by theme. They're not tied together by setting. They're not tied together by genre. They're not tied together by, whatever the author's intent is. And suddenly there's this epiphanous moment where they just merge, and they complete one another, and you go, "Wow!" This, all the circuit lights up completely. And you just kind of, and when that happens, that's just delightful. You sort of, I think the writer lives for those moments. And it's this great eureka moment where you just go, "Oh my God, that would be sweet. It's a very much an instinctual thing. It's very much it's a feeling. It's you just hear the internal bell go off, and you go, "Oh, okay, great, right, we got something nice there."
Okay.
So we kind of talked about the process of kind of getting ideas for a story. This question is more about your characters.
Yep.
Their personalities tend to run the gamut. You have everybody from
Yep.
from Sweeney in The Resurrectionist to Sylvia in The Skin Palace. Do you have any process for creating a personality?
To me, I guess I would say that personality, character personality, or character, the essence of a character is revealed to me, I guess I'd say in voice. I know that I either have the character or that I want to pursue the character when I can sort of hear the sound of their head in my own head, if that makes any sense at all. I have sometimes in the past, I'm not big on, less so than with settings, where I do draw from sort of real world models.
Mm-hmm.
I will steal kind of trivial characteristic traits, or sometimes I think mannerisms or speaking style. I've done that in the past and sort of tried to apply it to a character. But it has more to do with sort of understanding the character from inside out, meaning, I guess, what does this person desire? What do they need? And what is it about not only the environment in which they dwell, but about themselves that is preventing, that is creating the conflict that is the essence of your story. Sweeney, for instance, is kind of an interesting example to me because, he's sort of classically, in some ways, the guy who gets in his own way. And I've heard comments about that he's not a real likable character in some ways. I think he frustrated a lot of people. The other comment I've heard that I think is interesting is that, and it sounds disingenuous when I say this, I know, I'm aware of that, but people close around me have said, yeah, there's a lot of you in Sweeney. which makes me laugh even harder when I hear people say he's a really unpleasant character. Yeah, characters are just, it's kind of an interesting process in that I don't know that there's any cut and dry way of. I would have more difficulty, I think, trying to instruct somebody in character creation than anything else. I can sit down and have, in the past with students, I can talk about plot until I'm blue in the face. That's very mechanical to me. It's very almost maybe too mechanical in some instances, and I can talk about construction of setting. And I can even talk about thematic concerns and how and why they would originate in the writer's psyche. But character is I guess it's somewhat organic. It's very much a. I don't know that I can be more. It isn't very clear, but I don't know the thing that sounds the most correct and appropriate to me at this moment is that I know that I have a character that interests me when I am sort of hearing that character's voice in my head. And when I say voice, I don't just mean dialogue. I mean sort of the interior monologue of that character as well.
Okay. So, like we said before, a lot of people have kind of classified your works into the noir crime kind of category. But I saw that a lot of your earlier works had kind of a cop and robber kind of feel.
Yeah.
Kind of an authority figure of the law with interacting with the city. In The Resurrectionist, it kind of felt different, and I was wondering kind of like what brought on the change.
I would say, I guess, just natural evolution of where I'm sort of just chasing my own tail a lot of the time. And I love the noir stuff. I've read tons of it over the last 20 years or so, especially that sort of American mid-century paperback writer, a 60,000 word Lion book, gold medal book, Jim Thompson, David Gudis, Gil Brewer. I love those guys. And I played with a lot of those devices and a lot of those conventions through the earlier books. But I think what has happened is I am allowing myself at this point, foolishly or otherwise, to simply follow the stories kind of where they want to go in the city where it's going. Again, it was something of an accident the way the early books were, constructed and marketed. In that, and an example I can give you is I had contracted for 2 books after Box 9, and Wireless came out, and I was working at the time that Wireless was published. I was working on The Skin Palace, and I turned in a few months after Wireless was published. I turned in the first draft of The Skin Palace to my agent, and what I recall is him calling me up pretty soon after he received it. He said, it's an interesting book, but you signed a contract for sort of this noir crime mystery hard-boiled book, and there are no criminals in this, there are no cops in this, there are no gangsters, there are no, he's sort of laughing a little bit. And what happened is, the entire, if you've read Skin Palace, that entire secondary story of the Kinski family, Herman Kinski and his son Jacob and his cousin, that was all layered in afterwards. The book originally was just about, Sylvia, about this young woman who's sort of in the midst of metamorphosis, and she finds an old camera that has some curious images on it, and I sort of just chased that. And it was much more of the first draft was much more of sort of played with Gothic conventions, much more than noir or hard-boiled, though there is probably some connection between them. At this point, you know, all bets are off. I don't really know. I mean, the state of publishing is insane right now anyway. And I'm just, I mean, you sort of have to keep the original reasons why you started doing this curious activity in the first place in the forefront of your heart. And you know, I often say, you know, the books are just the end product of this very quirky pre-dawn hobby that I have, you know, this very strange activity that kind of just gives me a particular kind of joy and meaning. And since that's the case, I'm really beholden to just, you know, sort of tramping along after whatever story captivates me.
Okay.
So, okay. I mean, what I would say is that looking forward, I believe that my stories will continue to be set in Quinsigamond. And the nature of Quinsigamond is that it is a sort of a noir machine.
Right.
So, to that extent, there'll always be these noir elements in it. But, you know, to give you an example, I wrote a novel that I never even took to market after Word Made Flesh, that had no noir or crime or hard-boiled elements to it whatsoever. You know, it was kind of a satirical road novel, you know, that sort of originated in Quinsigamond and ended in Quinsigamond. And it was completely out of character. And we never, you know, my agent, we had a conversation when it was done. You know, I spent a year and a half for about 400-page draft. And he said, yeah, it's an interesting book, but, you know, it will only serve to confuse whatever readership you have managed to build over the course of 5 books. Right. They'll say, why does it have Jack O'Connell's name on it? It's not a Jack O'Connell. So I'm just going to chase story. You know, I'm going to chase whatever stories are, you know, appeal to me, or that, I guess the better way to say it is the stories that I feel compelled to tell. Say, I guess.
Right. Okay. So this is more of a general question about, you know, maybe somebody looking to get into the creative writing, the professional field. Do you have any advice for someone that's kind of looking to break into the life of an established writer?
You know, all bets are off, I think, right now. I don't, you know, I'm not a pessimist. I have said repeatedly, I continue to think that as long as we, you know, define ourselves as human, we're going to need story, we're going to need narrative. It's, you know, we've needed it from the beginning. The problem is that the structures and the media that conveys that narrative is changing so rapidly. Right. And you can either, I mean, there's 2 ways to sort of think about it as far as, once again, that binary dialectic coming into play. You know, you can either say, as I know some writers who do feel this way, you know, I'm going to go down with the ship, you know. I'm going to still write the way I always wrote. I'm going to still write, you know, prose narrative. I'm still going to write novels, you know, until the day they don't make novels anymore. Or you can say, what's on the horizon? What can I look at and embrace? And I'm a bit of a pendulum, you know. I feel like I was born on the fault line between the print age and the digital age, and it's funny too, because I find I'm pretty easily influenced. I'll sit down and have you know, lunch with older writers I know, you know, and it's just the apocalypse, you know. They just, that's the end of the world, you know. Drink up, mates, and then I'll have, you know, lunch with younger writers I know. You know, there's a guy in his 30s who's just, you know, I've been working with him on. He's been working on his first novel for 10 years, you know, and he is very comfortable with the rapidity and the essence of the digital, you know, revolution that's happened and how it impacts narrative, you know, and he's all excited about you know, the brave new world of transmedia, you know, of telling large, you know, epic stories across a variety of mediums. So it almost depends on what day you ask me what kind of a response you're going to get. I, you know, in terms of advice to anyone, I don't have pragmatic advice because that wasn't my experience. If you have, I have always had the sense that, based on my own experience, you sort of become a writer because you don't have any choice. You are compelled to do this. Come hell or high water, and you find a way to do it. You find a way to satisfy that need. I remember the great, I think it was, I'll attribute it to Don Westlake, who died a few years ago, great prolific novelist, and he said something about, when he was trying to become a professional writer, earn his keep through writing, he refused to have everyone around him, his very pragmatic family, would say, well, just, have a backup plan. And he said, I refuse to have a backup plan because, let me tell you, you will use your backup plan. That's the nature. That's the one thing you need to know about the writing life. If you have a backup plan, you'll eventually utilize it because it's a tough haul. But it's always been a tough haul. I love literary biography. I read a lot of it. It was, read Melville's life story. That's instructive. His Melville. Utterly ignored, thought insane, and reduced for the last 20 years of his working life to, working in the customs house, people thought he was dead 10 years before he died, that sort of, I think to me that's the paradigm for the American writer's life. So I had no illusions sort of going in, It's always, to me, when I publish a book, it's always another miracle, wonderful, incredible, it happened again.
In past interviews, because I'll admit that I looked those up, you mentioned surfistas and kind of modern street gangs as possibilities for future works. But are there any hints for what's coming up?
I wish I could give you some hints. I've tried twice. 10 years ago, and the last 2 years, to take a crack at this idea I had for the what we'll call the surfista novel. That's based on a article I read years ago, back in the early 90s, about some street kids down in Rio, down in Brazil, who were not allowed onto the beaches, where they would, they'd stay on the outskirts and watch the tourist surfers, surf the waves at Rio. But these urchins were not allowed sort of onto the beach. In fact, there were, and I used some of this material. There were there's a couple of good books about it. There were death squads. The merchants by the resort areas were hiring local police to actually kill these homeless kids because they didn't want the tourists bothered. But what the kids did, because they couldn't really surf, they started surfing on the tops of commuter trains, going 100 miles an hour. And the thing that intrigued me about that was an entire community evolved out of this fad. And it was terrifically dangerous. There was kids would get killed. There was a hierarchy based on how many injuries you had, how many burns, and how many broken bones. They developed even a vocabulary. They had names they would call each other, and that was one of those instances, probably 18 years ago or so, where I read something and sort of in an instant I knew, I got a story there. But unfortunately, I've taken two, and this is instructive, I guess. I've taken two hard runs at it, and accumulated pages in both instances. But as I say, about 12 years ago, I gave it a try and went off track, so to speak, give the pun. And then in the last 2 years, I tried again, and I could not. The book just sort of dissolved in my hands. So I do hope that it's a book I hope to write one of these days, and I hope that a moment arrives where I sort of figure out how to construct that book and bring it to fruition. Just recently, I just started something new. I don't know where it's going right now. I don't, but I'm just chasing it. You know, I'm just chasing it down. It's something completely different for me that I have never, sort of a very different kind of story for me, deeply personal, and it's the kind of thing. In fact, it's so. It's probably the most personal thing I've ever attempted to write, to the point where I'm not even sure it's something I would ever take to market. You know, I want to chase it to completion, but I don't know if it's a story I'll share ever. You know,
Right.
it may be one for the desk drawer. You know, we'll find out.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, there are dozens of stories sitting in my story notions, as I call them, sitting in my file cabinets. That my hope is, you know, if my health holds out and my, you know, abilities hold on for a little while longer, I hope to at least, you know, develop a few more of them.
All right. Well,
Great.
thank you so much for your space.
My pleasure. Thanks, Steve.